For centuries, the Catholic Church emphasized the astonishingly realistic depictions of Renaissance masters like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. But in the 17th century, art took a dramatic turn. High ceilings covered in golden arches of intricate carvings, white angels twirling and singing during the opening of the heavens, billowing clouds and rays of sunshine breaking through the frame. They call this the epitome of Baroque art. It was developed to evoke spiritual emotions in response to the Protestant Reformation by using vivid colors and elaborate movements, such as the trompe-l'œil technique. Professor of Theology and Art, Father Jean-Paul Hernandez, explains the mechanics behind this phenomenon.
So it's an illusion, optical illusion. You have the impression that you have a three-dimension object, but in fact, actually there is only two-dimension objects.
Kitty-cornered on your way to St. Peter's Square, the humble Chiesa del Gesù is where Baroque architect and painter Andrea Pozzo's first masterpiece rests, the altar and tomb of St. Ignatius of Loyola.
This altar is the most important altar for every Jesuit because the body of St. Ignatius is buried here. And the program of this altar is fantastic. The altar was made in 1695 by a Jesuit, Pozzo, Fratel Pozzo, a brother, a Jesuit brother, and he built it as a message, as a spiritual message.
The painting portrays Jesus Christ giving the flag of his mission to Ignatius, the founder of the Society of Jesus. Chiesa del Gesù is the mother church for the Jesuits. Built in 1568 after St. Ignatius' death, the Baroque style had one precise message to instill.
The name of Jesus as the synthesis, as a summary of the way to be in intimacy with the Lord. So how to pray? Just say Jesus, just say the name of Jesus, just speak with Jesus like to a friend. And that's a teaching of the spiritual exercises.
But out of the hundreds of Catholic churches in Rome's city centre, why is this one so unique? The clock strikes 5:30. Brilliant lights turn heads towards Pozzo's masterpiece, and all of a sudden, the painting starts descending. A 300-year-old Baroque tradition awakens.
All this movement comes slowly down at a certain time, which what we call macchina barocca, which is a Baroque machine with pulleys and ropes. At that time it was amazing, and this picture comes down, and what can we see? The statue of the saint, the statue of St. Ignatius. And the effect is that it is like if Ignatius goes up, up, up to the heaven, coming from his urn, from his tomb, to the higher level, to the heaven, and that's why we have the same image of the statue represented in the ark above, over the altar, and also on the dome. Exactly the same image of Ignatius in three different steps, climbing to the sky, and presented to the Lord by Saint Peter.
St. Ignatius' feast day is celebrated July 31st as the patron saint of soldiers, soldiers in war, and soldiers for the Church.
We've just walked into Il Gesù, the mother church of the Society of Jesus, commonly known as the Jesuits. This order was founded by Ignatius of Loyola, a Spanish noble who focused on preaching and converting the peoples of the world to Catholicism.
Especially in Asia and Latin America. In the late 16th century, there was a need for a new kind of church architecture. The Protestant Reformation had occurred, Protestants challenging the authority of the Church in Rome, the Pope. The Counter-Reformation had begun, the Catholic Church's efforts to fight back against Martin Luther, and the Jesuits were the main allies of the Pope in this response to Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation.
And the effort to reassert the supremacy of the Catholic Church.
This is the Church triumphant. When you walk in here, there's no doubt that the Church has a sense that it has triumphed and will triumph over the challenge of Protestantism.
The focus, as soon as you walk into the church, is on the altar and the performance of the Eucharist that takes place there.
Transubstantiation, the changing of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. More masses were performed during this period. More preaching took place. There was an engagement of the laity that was critical in this Counter-Reformation period.
And the church is enormous in order to hold the great
Welcome, everyone. Thank you to our live. It's been quite a while. We are so excited to have Leo Zagami here today. Thank you for joining us, Leo.
Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to meet you and to meet your audience.
Wonderful. I have asked for a sound check with the audience. If you could let us know, give us a thumbs up that you hear Leo okay. All right, we'll just continue. Yeah, I know, right? They'll let us know if they don't. So, Mr. Zagami is an author of many books, but this most recent one, I don't know if you can see it, I have a screen for it too, Confessions of an Illuminati. And this is number 12 in a series. You've also written a couple of others. Okay, yes. They hear you. That's wonderful. Okay, so I have to tell you, this, people, is over a 400-page book. 2.5 days of reading this book, and there's not a page that is not highlighted, underlined, and then I have a lot of dog ears. So I want to thank you for this book. It was very timely, and even in light of the passing of Pope Francis, it's just like God had everything lined up in his timing to bring this forward for such a time as this. So I know we can't get through everything today. I have a slight agenda, so we'll see if we can follow it. First of all, I would like to hear maybe 5 or so minutes of your testimony, Leo. What is your background that you know about this? And what has God done in your life to bring you where you are today?
I was born in Rome on 5th of March 1970 in the hospital where usually the popes are curated or taken care of, which is the Policlinico Gemelli. I was born from a Catholic mother and father who are both aristocrats from two very influential families. And for that reason, I was brought into the church very early, as it's tradition, and under Don Mario Pieracci, who later became Monsignor Mario Pieracci, the founder of SAT 2000, which is at present the official TV of the Bishop Conference in Italy. I started my path in the media, initially with a small appearance during what was basically telling small fairy tales to the kids when I was 10 years old in a show that was, of course, co-produced with us as children, just acting in this whole thing. And then, of course, later on, I wanted to really get into the radio business, and the priest, Don Mario Pieracci, who is also a media personality, very well known in Italy because he also worked for many years on Rai, which is a national TV, and collaborated with many other outlets. He told me, if you want your own show, you have to serve mass. So I ended up serving mass as the chief altar boy for 3 years before I eventually got my first radio show on Sunday. It was a Sunday of December 1983. I was still very young. I was 13 years of age, but I managed to upset the bishop immediately because I was broadcasting a relax of Frankie Goes to Hollywood, which wasn't really a Catholic track, let's say, a Christian song. But later on, I went on to work also with this TV project, which he was starting. At the time, it was based only in the region there where I was broadcasting from, in the province of Rome. And then later on, I also started professionally with many other radios, and I eventually did very well in the music business as a record producer. But at the same time, I always had a passion for journalism and a passion for the media. So I ended up working for a bunch of radios all over Europe, and also national radios of a certain importance, from the Norwegian NRK to Russian radio. I was the first Westerner to actually broadcast there in the Putin era, right at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s. And so I worked and made my way through the media, but at the same time, I was also mentored in journalism by now deceased journalist called Dino D'Arcangelo, who worked for La Repubblica, which was a popular Italian newspaper. And at the same time, I was initiated into Freemasonry in 1993 and the Illuminati of the New World Order by Prince Aliata di Montereale. And I started a path within the secret societies we commonly refer to as the Illuminati until 2006, more or less. I think 2006 was the year I really broke with that reality, because I started to discover things I didn't like in 2003, and after 3 years of internal squabbles and fights, I actually came out of it, and I started my blog in the fall of 2006, which was called Confessions of an Illuminati. But that brought me a lot of reaction. I was living in Norway at the time. I got accused of espionage. I got in trouble, and they took away from me my son I never saw again, because at the time I was married with this Muslim woman. I talk about it in volume 10 of my Confessions, which is about Islamic Freemasonry and the secret societies behind the eternal conflict in the Middle East. And this is actually the last installment of the Illuminati Confessions, which is 12 books, which is a project which I started to put together in Japan and published in Japan. In 2009, I started to publish the books in Japan. And after I published my first books there, I went on to publish eventually my first 3 books, volume 1, 2, and 3, in 2012 in Italy. And that was the moment in which the Vatican had actually offered me money on the table and success and career if I refused to publish these books. But of course, I didn't go along with what they required. It was a specific request from the Vatican intelligence and by Marinelli, who used to be in charge of the security for John Paul II. He invited me, I remember, in the back room of an important church in Rome, La Chiesa del Tritone, I think it was. And then I, of course, later on instead went on and published these books, because I didn't like the idea of going along with what they required. I mean, I felt like a mission. I felt like this truth needed to be revealed. Like, it says the truth should set you free, but why was the Vatican so eager to not get this truth out? They knew I had published those books in Japan, but like I also explained in volume 12, because of course it's a book about the Jesuits, and the Jesuits had a very big involvement in Japan. So I kind of like, they told me, if you just have these books out in Japan, for us it's no problem. Nobody reads Japanese outside of Japan. So you can continue producing bestsellers in Japan, because my books sold a lot in Japan. I mean, I'm talking about 200,000 copies. I'm not talking about little numbers. So I refused, and at that point, of course, they started to persecute me, censor me. I had published a book in 2013 on Pope Francis as soon as he was elected, criticizing him and explaining his connections with Freemasonry and the danger of the Jesuits taking the throne of St. Peter. And at that point, the persecution became very serious. I mean, they broke into my home, they locked me up. I basically hardly survived what happened, thanks also to the support that I had from my wife, who was there and was pretty shocked about what she was witnessing in Italy. A complete lack of freedom of press, unfortunately, characterizes Italy, and eventually we had to flee the country in 2019, in May 2019, and I never really went back. And I have recently asked the American ambassador nominated by Donald J. Trump, who I've always actively supported. I was the president of Italians for Trump in Italy, to see if it's possible for me to go back without any problem, because at the moment, when I simply announced I might go back to Italy, they went and interrogated my mother like I was some kind of criminal on the run in December. And I'm not even an Italian citizen any longer. I gave up my Italian citizen formally. I renounced it because Europe is a Jesuit creation, as you have seen on my book. And I don't really get along very well with the Jesuits for a number of reasons. Mostly because I know them very well. From when I was a kid, I was brought up within the Vatican and the Catholic Church. So to answer to your question, my experience is not only an experience that can be journalistic, so to speak, because I have also that experience, but it's also personal and direct experience. And it has to do also with all the various connections that the Vatican has with the secret societies like Freemasonry and the Illuminati, which are often speculated of these connections, but never really proven. Proving something is very different from simply speculating on something. And I experienced it on my own, that once I went against them, they were capable of doing things like locking me up in a little island in the middle of the Tiber, and then injecting me and doing all kinds of things that are completely, out of some kind of book for a normal person, out of a movie. But that was what happened. Eventually, I was accused of espionage. I had to leave Norway, where I was living in 2008. I had to flee that country. And like I said, I also had to renounce to something, because, at times in your life, you have to renounce to something to take something else. And I wasn't really about giving up on my mission, even when they told me, the Jesuits actually intervened with my first wife, who was Muslim. The actual Jesuit in charge was Thomas Michel. I talk about him in volume 10 of my confession in particular. He was in charge of the interreligious dialogue of the Jesuits at the time, but he was really living like a Muslim among Muslims in Turkey, even going to prayer on Fridays. So the Jesuits are really very much capable of disguising themselves, and that is, of course, their characteristic. They don't necessarily arrive as missionaries and simply preach the gospel. They want to integrate themselves and at times disguise themselves among the local cultures. So that is briefly how I came to start this confession series, which, like I said, was initially published in Japan, then at least some of the books, because I managed to publish 6 books in Japan. After that, they will not publish any other books because I started to expose things within the Japanese society, and they were not really, very happy about that. With the Japanese, you can expose anything, the most weird stuff from abroad. But when you start pinpointing on their own connections with the Opus Dei, the Jesuits, and everything else, they're like, no, that's so. Italy was a big success. The books were a very big success. I mean, when you're starting to sell 5,000 copies of a book in Italy, you are more than a bestseller, because Italy is a place where people don't read books. So even a minimal quantity for, the US is just nothing, 5,000 copies. But it is important for that context of Italy. And so I ended up on TV, on Berlusconi's channels and stuff. And I was regularly invited on TV until they understood that maybe my books were not simply a speculation, but rather a reality with names, dates, and people that were actually denounced in my books openly. Unfortunately, the Italian law treats defamation not only in the civil manner. So it's not only a matter of paying a fine, it's a criminal offense, and you get in jail. And that's how they shut journalists up in Italy, by submerging them with a bunch of lawsuits and defamation cases, which might end you up in jail. And for that reason, 2019, me and my wife decided to flee Italy and to leave it, that situation, because it was very dangerous for us.
That is amazing, Leo. I'm so sorry for how you were treated. I really am. I'm grateful that you remain convicted and strong and faithful. And God is using you in mighty ways, obviously.
Absolutely. I mean, I have, still to this day, I have many friends still in the Vatican, in the Catholic Church. You have to understand that my books became very popular, actually. They were kind of like the forbidden book that the people in the Vatican will keep under their desk and start reading. And so they were like, wherever I went to the Vatican, I was treated like some kind of, like a star, but at the same time, I was denouncing them. I remember, and this is the last chapter of the book, which I'm not sure you have read, where I talk about also the Jesuit nuns, which are the Jesuit order has affiliated groups of nuns that follow Ignazio Loyola's spiritual exercises. And in this last scene of the book, you have her and this Dominican, this layman Dominican, who are like, but the Freemasons, you have a ring. And I'm like, yeah, the lodges are there inside the Vatican. Please stop this hypocrisy. And, oh, no. Okay, you're a brother. You're a brother. We're going to give you everything. We're going to give you a special of Thomas Aquinas Summa Theologica for you, whatever you want. So the hypocrisy, unfortunately, is present, and it's that hypocrisy which really I tend to fight more than anything else in my mission. Then, of course, we are all sinners. Nobody's perfect. But what happens with the Vatican is that, unfortunately, there is also a lot of pedophilia, a lot of practices that are criminal and should be stopped, and that are not tackled enough. Like I said in this book, the day after Pope Francis dies, then you have the general of the Jesuits, current Jesuit General Arturo Sosa, saying, oh, Pope Francis wanted to do more. Well, yeah, we all wanted to do more, but if you didn't do more in 12 years on the throne of St. Peter, where you could actually have passed a canon law kicking out immediately anybody who has been involved in pedophilia, not just simply placing them from one church to the other. And this is a practice that even the current Pope has been actually involved with. So it's not something that we can tolerate. Now, I've noticed that the current Pope at the moment is being very much trying to not enter the political discourse like like Pope Francis. He's trying to be a little bit more moderate because there has been a backlash in donations for the Catholic Church because of Pope Francis, and what they care only about money. It's like their ministry is about. We have a saying in Italy: "Without the money, you don't sing the mass." That is the saying in the Vatican. It's like no money, no mass. What can you do? So,
Wow.
and all the money that is collected every time in a church is then sent to St. Peter's Pence and becomes a very important part of this equation. So the most important and influential bishop conference and group of churches that sends money is, of course, the United States of America, and that's why they have appointed an American Pope in the hope of reacquiring some credibility here in the United States of America.
Which is going to be hard to do with Trump right now. And it's interesting, I did hear a few years ago that the Vatican called all the money back to the Vatican. So I'd like to talk about that, but I have some other points I want to hit.
Well, actually, I tell you one thing about
Okay.
the Vatican. You remember when Ratzinger was about to resign, and suddenly the SWIFT was taken off the Vatican bank transfers and stuff, and the cash machines of the Vatican were closed down. A couple of weeks before Ratzinger resigned, there was actually an attempt to influence even more his resignation. But at the same time, he had sent all the gold to the Deutsche Bank. So the actual gold that was present in the Vatican vaults was transferred to Deutschland. So that is something that happened during the papacy of Ratzinger, which was a very controversial pope, as he had been the head of the Congregation for the Mothers of Faith, and he had been very tolerant of pedophilia, and he himself had a lot of skeletons in the closet, so the Jesuit could then force him out at the appropriate time. And as you know, I have also made some new revelations here in this book, which I'm sure you have appreciated.
Yes, yes. It's just amazing, the thread of this type of thing throughout. Each pope, a lot of people involved in the higher ups. So that is a topic for another day. So thank you for addressing that. Absolutely. What I'd like to do is put some pieces together for the people, just a touch here and a touch there. The Illuminati, for example, you were an Illuminist, and I have something here. So can you tell us a little bit about the Illuminati, what they stand for, and then in particular, the Alumbrados?
The Alumbrados, the Illuminati, as you intend, usually people, when they talk about the Illuminati, they refer to Adam Weishaupt's Illuminati, which was a rather later formation, but it was the most known of the Illuminati because it codified for the first time a series of practices to infiltrate politics, Freemasonry, and so on. And so it created really the basis for something that was unprecedented. The other groups, like the Alumbrados, were mostly focusing as Illuminati. They were mixing Gnosticism, because the Illuminati were Gnostics, and that's why I explained this in volume 9 of my Confessions. The original Illuminati were Gnostics, and they infiltrated even Christianity. When the fathers of the church were so hard on Gnosticism, it was because they were the Illuminati of the time, and they had mixed Christianity with elements of paganism or elements that were in the mystery schools present since the times of Babylonia. And there were not only Gnostics in Christianity, but Gnostics also in the Jewish tradition that eventually will bring out heresies also within the Jewish tradition. So the Gnostics mixed up with the Jewish Kabbalah and the Jewish presence in the Iberic Peninsula, and also the Moorish presence. So the, let's say, the esoteric side of Islam created the basis for the Alumbrados. But if we see the Illuminati are also considered Illuminati, the Rosicrucians are considered Illuminati. Before even the Illuminati of Adam Weishaupt, the Illuminati were the Rosicrucians. But the Rosicrucians themselves, what were they? They were with their manifesto. And as you know, at the beginning of the Counter-Reformation, so they were actually fiercely critical of Rome, and they came out in 1610 onwards, these manifestos from Germany, from a Protestant background, but that was, of course, immediately noticed by the Jesuits, who then infiltrated the Rosicrucians later on. In the matter of a century, they managed to hack the system, infiltrate it, and then, of course, created their own system of Rosicrucian thought that could be easily manipulated from Rome. So you see, it's a very intricate and elaborate thing when you ask, you are an Illuminatus, but an Illuminatus is not just like, it's not a simple thing. You have to study many, many, many years, and it's not something that is simply given to you with an initiation. Of course, you have to do initiations. I have done all kinds of initiations when I was within various groups that I was a commander of the Fraternity Rosicruciana Antigua. I was a member, high-level member of the Ordo Templi Orientis. I was in Freemason at 33 degree. Then I went on to study also the emulation rite and many other rituals and rites of Freemasonry. It's very confusing for the ordinary folk. And so for the first time in this last installment, to actually have the understanding that ultimately on top of the pyramid, you have the Jesuits in the seat of power that then controls this whole, it's the Luciferian court, as I explained it. And Lucifer is not necessarily for the Gnostics a negative thing, because they have a completely different understanding of Lucifer. So in a more Prometheus kind of way, they are thinking that it's necessary to act and to actually have that kind of knowledge to become themselves gods. Mm-hmm. And that is, of course, something of an heresy. When at the time of Ignazio Loyola, who was like the video you shared at the beginning, somebody who was in the past a soldier, but he was from a noble family. He was brought up in a castle. And he was brought up in the Iberic Peninsula within the Basque community, which is itself still to this day very separated from the rest of Spain in the way even their DNA is different. The Basque are said to be descendants of the ancient Atlanteans. So he felt that the Alumbrados were very interesting, and for that reason he became interested in the Alumbrados, and he became at that point he came under the lens of the infamous Spanish Inquisition, and he was arrested. Mm-hmm. And he was threatened, and then at one point he had fought. And he had been injured, and he had this illumination in Montserrat, which is a beautiful place. It's a very inspiring place. I mean, I went there myself, as I stayed in the book at a very young age with my grandmother. And my grandmother herself was somebody who introduced me to Aleister Crowley, who was working for the British intelligence during the Second World War. So, I mean, we're not talking about simply a grandmother, bring you to Montserrat. No, it was somebody with a lot of knowledge. We were there actually in Barcelona guested by one of her friends who were doing this lavish party in this I remember this cinematic setting in Montjuic, and it was rather incredible. But she was capable of telling me things that for the normal folk. I mean, and she was saying them in interviews at the time, even on TV, because she was often guested on TVs, on national TVs in Germany, in England. And she was talking about things like Eyes Wide Shut scenarios that were just outrageous for the normal person. But, I mean, I was brought up in that kind of situation, and I quickly understood that there was two different levels, whereby you have the elite that behaves in a certain way, and you have the normal folk who is instead has to, let's say, live by what they tell him. They teach him certain things. The church is very good at controlling, but are themselves then innocent as they claim? Unfortunately, that's not the case. Often they are hypocrites, and there is a lot of hypocrisy in general in organized religion because of the limits of man. Of course, that is a very important thing. But at the same time, we have always God that brings new voices, new prophets, new people who have, but then the problem is also that in the end times you have a bunch of false prophets, of antichrist, that ultimately will materialize with some kind of figure that will be aided by the cyber Satan thing, which I have discussed in 3 of my confessions. And at the end of this book, as you know, because it's a topic that the Jesuits are particularly interested to, because the Jesuits have always been interested in science. And they have been interested in science, they have been interested in astronomy. Yes. They created the Collegium Romanum on the ruins of the biggest temple of ancient times dedicated to Isis. There has always been a connection with the mother goddess in the Jesuits. It's particularly evident with not only Ignazio Loyola, and of course his first vision in front of the Black Mary of Montserrat, that is of course it's a place of worship of a goddess. It can be Isis, it can be other, but they are quite fixated with Isis. In fact, Athanasius Kircher who was one of the first professors at the Collegium Romanum, wrote one also of the first books to finally decrypt the hieroglyphs of ancient Egypt, even before the Rosetta Stone. The Collegium Romanum was the second university of importance that the Jesuits inaugurated after the one in Messina. Messina is the place of my father, where my father was born. It's the place where my family for hundreds of years was in charge of power. We are talking about, I was, when I identify and I say that, I'm talking about marquis, barons, and princes of the Sacred Roman Empire, meaning real power. We're not talking about power of life and death over people. It's that's how it was in Sicily back then. And to a certain extent, we can say that with the mafia, it's still that way, but it is a different kind of situation, of course.
Yes. Can we go back to just a little second on Loyola? He had his first vision in front of the Black Madonna, and you mentioned he was arrested. He was arrested for some occult kind of witchcraft.
He was arrested for his connection with the Alumbrados, first of all, which eventually somehow he got out of that. But he was arrested more than once. Some sources say 5 times, some sources say 3 times. He was arrested several times in Spain, but also he was threatened with being arrested even in France when he eventually created in Montmartre in 1534 the first original nucleus on the 15th of August of the Jesuits before being accepted by the Vatican. He had been under the lens of the Inquisition for a long time because his practices were very, he hypnotized young girls. He did all kinds of stuff which is not really the stuff of saints. But in the end, the Pope of that time accepted this proposal of having this new order that could somehow help the Counter-Reformation. I think that without the 1540 and what happened in Tivoli and the acceptance of the Jesuits, the Company of Jesus, the Society of Jesus as it's known these days, we will never arrive to the Council of Trent as we know it, which is a pivotal moment in the history of the Church, because that's the moment in which the Church has to address Martin Luther, has to address an evolving situation with England also breaking up from the Church. We have Calvin, we have, a situation that, of course, of embarrassment for the Church, because the Church for a few hundred years had popes who were really not really holy in any way, shape, or form. Some of them were really depraved. Some of them were simply put there because they were representatives of the black aristocracy, which is the aristocracy that leads from Rome and that is close to the Vatican. When people talk about the black aristocracy is the aristocracy which is closer to the Vatican. That is what.
Oh, okay.
That's basically what the term black aristocracy. In fact, black aristocracy is a term that these days not used anymore, since the reforms that has been there since the Second Vatican Council have kind of taken away from the black aristocracy their places of responsibility within the Vatican. Then some people talk about the three popes, and they point at this eventual great pope as a figure from the black aristocracy. In reality, the current black pope is a person of importance. And of course, we have the white pope, which is the one that in Roman they call il biancone, the white guy. While instead, the black pope, Papa Nero, is the one that they always consider the more influential, and currently is Arturo Sosa. Like I said, the great figure, the great pope that a lot of people have been always pointing to, is more of a speculative thing, because they say Pepersini, all these kind of things. And I know these families very well because I was brought up there. And I can tell you that in reality, the black aristocracy this day has still a lot to do with the Vatican Bank. When there was that decision to bring those gold with Ratzinger out of the vaults and bring it to the Deutsche Bank in Germany, it was actually through a member of the black aristocracy that happened. So the black aristocracy still has and you have the Orsini, you have the Colonna, you have Brancaccio. These are the families that are part of this, and many of them had their own popes during the history of the Church. So, that gives them an extra, while instead my family from my father's side was from the mentors of Frederick II Barbarossa, which was called an heretic by the Pope and wanted to wage war against the Vatican, because they understood that the way the Vatican was carrying itself was mostly because of power, of political interest, and not really because of religion. Nowadays, the Pope is pretending to be a religious figure, but in the past, 1,000 years ago, trust me, he was no religious figure. He was a monarch, first of all. Remember that also, we're talking about, nowadays we are used to a little city within Rome with 900 people who are members of this, this elite, we say, because they are citizens of the Vatican. Today are elitarian because they don't pay tax on. We consider them in Rome the elite of the elite because they don't pay tax on gasoline. They have special medicines at their pharmacy. They have all kinds of privileges still to this day. But especially the pump of gasoline, if you are capable of having the prices at the, and put the gasoline in your car from one of the pumps of the Vatican, you must be.
That's so interesting.
I know it sounds
the Bible says that God was not a respecter of persons.
The thing is this, when in this book I describe how Ignatius of Antioch has almost created artificially the lineage that goes from Peter down to all the various popes. It is an artificial construct. So there is no Bible that says the Pope is in Rome.
Interesting.
Then Peter eventually, but Peter, was at the time with many other people in charge of various communities, and each one of them considered itself to be a bishop of equal importance. And that's why the Vatican last year has, on the 13th of June, rediscussed the whole thing, because now that they want to create a one-world religion, it's almost inconvenient to have a pope. It's almost a position that creates problems, because they want to bring the Orthodox back into the fold. They want to bring all the Protestants back into the fold. Everybody, but if you have this position of supremacy on a throne, that doesn't give you that equal setting,
Mm-hmm.
So suddenly they admit that they made the whole thing up.
Wow. They made up a lot of things. So there's tradition, and then there's the Bible. So
Absolutely.
Very interesting.
And there is the fact that when Christianity, and this year we celebrate also the Council of Nicaea, because that is the pivotal moment for, the Council of Nicaea is the moment in which Christianity is kind of filtered of all the heresies, the Arian heresy, the Gnostic heresy, or whatever heresy, or whatever book didn't fit in the narrative of Rome, because in any case, Jesus needed to fit the narrative that they were, they were absorbing other faiths, not eliminating them completely, because Rome couldn't simply. Rome always had a Pontifex Maximus. Mm-hmm. That is not a title that is Christian at all. It's a Christian title to say, of course, bishop, but Pontifex Maximus is a different title. It's a title that in ancient Rome was presiding over every single cult. He was the chief.
Was considered a deity, right?
He was a high priest. And then, of course, the Pontifex Maximus, deity. In ancient Rome, the empire was a god. So, the emperor, was a god. So, the fact that you had to be a god to be respected in ancient Rome, that's pretty obvious. Now, the Council of Nicaea was held in 325 AD. And it's the first ecumenical council of the Christian Church. And for that reason, this year, Leo XIV is focusing very much on this reapproaching with Bartholomew I, with the Coptic churches, with bringing back to the fold what they lost 1,000 years ago, because it's almost 1,000 years from the schism between East and West, from that created the Orthodoxy. And then you have, of course, then the Reformation, which created another rupture, another breaking point for the church. All these breaking points, think about it. Martin Luther was an Augustinian friar, like the present Pope. And so, for that reason, the Jesuit Pope that preceded him decided to have him as the next Pope, because he's in charge of bringing back into the fold all the Protestant. The Anglican are already back. The Anglican are already taken. Now it's just a matter, and the Unitarians, the Episcopal, they are all now aligned with the Jesuits. And actually, you can see it even in the protests in LA when they did the vigil with all the religious leaders praying together. It was a Jesuit in charge of the whole group.
I have a couple of things from that. Let's see. So here we go. Okay. So because of your book, I kind of had an idea that the Jesuits had their hands in a lot of things, right? Jesuit theater, et cetera, et cetera. But I was prompted with these riots to go and look, where did Newsom, our governor, go to school? And this is what I found.
Jesuit, of course.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, he actually admitted that he learned everything about Jesus from the Jesuits, his version of Christianity, and also his politics. Because, as you know, in my book, I have explained how every single politician who has come out of a Jesuit institution is a Jesuit agent when they don't give up on the whole thing, like, for example, Trump did. But Trump was very particular. He kind of studied with the Jesuits for 2 years simply to learn, and he learned a lot. And then he told them to basically, I don't want to say it here because we are in a...
Thank you.
Okay. But you can imagine. And so that is what Trump has done. And that is really what my book brings to light. The fact that 2 secret societies within Fordham campus wanted to enroll him, but he didn't want to have that kind of level of submission towards the Jesuit order.
I love how he is a free thinker, and he really thinks outside of the box and turns things around and is proactive against them. And in your book, you mentioned you waited to write these things because you wanted it sealed tight, because you know how Jesuits think, and you wanted to have everything in place so they couldn't argue against it. That is amazing. That kind of mental gymnastics.
Yeah.
So.
No, well, in fact, the only criticism that one person did on one of the reviews on Amazon was simply to consider this a historical essay rather than a contemporary book. And I actually think that's not really, I mean, if that's the only criticism they can make, well, you have to know the past in order to know the future. And
Exactly.
this book, as you have read it yourself, it's not only an historical essay.
No, why can't it be both?
Yeah.
Right? History repeats itself, and we're seeing these things. And with Newsom, all the politics that we've had to deal with in California, all of this for me explains it. The taking care of the marginalized, how they're using the marginalized to further their agendas.
Yeah. And a lot of people ask me, why did you go and live in California? Why did you leave Rome? Why did you leave Rome to go to the... And I said, I wanted to go from the heart of the beast to the mind of the beast, because nowadays this is where the place that is creating cyber Satan is being built. And California is a Jesuit stronghold because it was Mexican territory, and Mexico was a Jesuit stronghold because, of course, of the Kingdom of Spain. The Jesuits went along with the Empire of Spain and the Empire of Portugal hand in hand. And that's why, sorry to say that, but Central and South America, it's a place, it's a hell zone. And I'm saying that not because I despise Latin people, because my grandfather was born in Chile. And as you know from the end of this book, 2 members of my family have been leading Jesuits, including the mentor of Pope Francis. So, I mean, it's like the Lion family, karmically speaking, has a responsibility. And I explained this at the end of the book, and where I shared the photo of Father Carlos Aldunate Lion, or his brother, who was the head of the Jesuits in Chile. And it was in Chile that Pope Francis went and studied. And Chile is a very important nation within the Jesuit structure. You have to understand that the Jesuits experimented communism before the Illuminati, who are their own, the Illuminati, the Freemasons, and all that are simply the Luciferian court that runs around and does the job for them. But in reality, the Jesuits experimented communism in the reducciones. And when I see people, especially these days with what is going on in Los Angeles, I mean, the Jesuits have created homeboys industries with this Jesuit priest who is in charge of this whole thing, treating these Chicanos, these Latinos, like they are almost the Indios of the Reducciones of a few hundred years ago. They are very much kept under control, under their watchful eye. And I show here on my own show.
Yes, this is from your show.
The Jesuits actively involved in the protests. People, of course, they don't like to mention that.
Yes,
and why
this
like
man here on the left is a priest at the rally.
Yeah, but why they don't like to mention all this?
As well as over here.
They don't like to mention this because they always like to depict the church or the Jesuits like an innocent group of priests, when instead, from reading my book, you have understood that they are nothing like an innocent group. I mean, they are a secret society themselves with various levels. And in these various levels, we have Jesuits who are more politically involved, less politically involved, who operate as spy and secret agents. Then you have lower levels that might simply be nice priests. But the Jesuits tend to be, most of them, inclined to take the fourth vow. And as I explain in my book, the fourth vow is something that then puts them irremediably and irreversibly in a clash with Jesus and Christianity, because when you are there to take the fourth vow, meaning complete submission to the Pope, and the Pope can tell you, go and kill that, go and do this, go and do that, that is no longer Christianity. That is becoming basically the 007 of His Majesty the Black Pope. And that's why 007 became 007. John Dee, who created 007, was fighting the Jesuits for Elizabeth I. So, I mean, it was the counterintelligence of the Jesuits that created the 007 myth.
Interesting. I read that in your book. There's just so much. I mean, and then they bring it to theater. So it's like everything is there. It's just understanding the back part of it. And you're putting these pieces together for people. Can we move into a Q&A?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. All right. Is there anything you wanted to say before we did that?
In regards to my book, as you know, I also focus on the immigration policies of the Jesuits because I knew that they will be very important and relevant, not only during the presidency of Joe Biden, where they literally opened the gates and said, okay, invade this country, bring in with the Jesuit NGOs millions and millions of Central and South America. With all the respect, I repeat, I am partly myself South America. I have family in Chile. I must say that the people in South and Central America are the most brainwashed by the Jesuits on the planet. And it's a very, it's very hurtful, I guess, for people in countries in South or Central America to hear that. But they have to admit that's the truth. Because for the last few hundreds of years, who is in charge of their societies?
Yes, the papacy.
And then the Freemasons who operate in South and Central America, they are not like the Freemasons that we have here. They operate hand in hand with the church. You have often, you find Jesuits in their lodges, a thing that doesn't happen here in America. Here in America, you might find the Jesuit playing golf with the worshipful master because, or the Grand Master of a state, because they are, of course, still together and they are the biggest donors at time in the Catholic Church, the Freemasons, even here in America. But in South America, in Central America, you actually end up with the Jesuits in the lodges working the rituals. And that is
Wow. There is a video that just came out in the last week that someone sent me, and I didn't know if I should put it in here or not. I'm going to put it in another segment for sure. But it shows this gentleman, they're doing construction on the Catholic Church. And there is the gates for the back hallway from the outside are open. And so this gentleman with a cell phone walked into this Masonic lodge. And this Freemason Masonic lodge, and he walked in and he was videotaping, and right inside the corridor there was a door, an opening into the Catholic Church. They're on the same block, one is one side, one is the other, and they're connected in the middle. You communicate back and forth.
Where was this? Where was
it's a video. I'll send it to you.
Where was the recorded the video?
I think it was somewhere in South America. I'm not sure.
Well, like I said, in my book, as you know, I have the testimony that I cited of a fourth vow Jesuit who was also a Freemason in South America, and he testimonies himself how he felt as a Freemason, as a Jesuit, and even had a family. And then the Jesuit general tells him, no, don't worry about your family, as long as you carry yourself in line with the precepts of the fourth vow and you continue your work, you can marry, you can do whatever you want. And this guy was a Mason in South America. He was a Jesuit, and he even had a Masonic lodge in Hungary, I think, out of all places, during the Cold War, which is completely unheard of. But the fact that I stick to facts in my books with sources which can't be debunked makes it very difficult. In fact, like I said, there's no criticism. If the biggest criticism they can wage to my book is that it's too much of a historical essay, which is not, well, it means that they don't really have any material to counteract.
Yes, exactly. If they can't come against the truth, they start attacking a character and other things and throwing you in jail. I'm sorry.
They did that in Europe, but unfortunately for them, now I'm in America and I'm protected by the First Amendment, which is a great protection. I mean, people who are born in America, they don't realize what it means. It's a big thing. It's a really big thing.
It is a big thing.
You know, when I became American, I went through the green card. There wasn't a normal thing. I was interrogated on every single aspect of my Masonic Illuminati work in the actual, green card. They sit you down there with your wife. My wife was shocked at what they were asking me. At one point, the guy asked me if I ever participated to a human sacrifice. So imagine what kind of questions were given. Yes. And when I was then on my own for my citizenship, instead of keeping me 15 minutes, they kept me 1 hour and 15 minutes. And they interrogated me on all my family's history going back, because as an aristocrat, they wanted to make sure I didn't have claim to some kingdom in a foreign land or something. And at the same time, there was all this whole thing that was very important for them. So they knew very well all my background, but to actually write every single lodge and order I belong to and give it to the custom, basically in charge of, it was quite, I think, unique.
Yes.
To obtain the citizenship. So
I can imagine sitting in your hot seat.
I'm very glad, and I'm very glad, and I'm very honored to be an American, and for that reason I gave up on my European citizenship. But also, it is, like I said, the First Amendment is of a great importance, together with the Second Amendment. It's things that the Europeans don't know anything about. Because remember, immediately after the Second World War, in every single country in Europe, just like Mao Zedong did in China, every single gun was confiscated. Nobody's allowed guns outside of very strict rules and regulations. And so that is the Second Amendment. The First Amendment, well, like I said, they use lawsuits to shut up every possible journalist who does his job. And nowadays, like J.D. Vance said in Munich, there is definitely a very big divide between the American values and the European values, which are, like I said, the values of the Jesuits. In my book, I explain how the Jesuits worked hand in hand with France and Germany, even before the end of the Second World War, so they could put together Europe under France and Germany. Because we think, there is many states in Europe, but they don't count anything. Even Italy is treated like a colony. It's France and Germany who is the driving force of Europe.
Which is where the Black Pope is, Germany, right?
Well, no, the Black Pope is in Rome, is in Borgo Santo Spirito. That is the headquarters of the Jesuits, and
Okay.
that is always been the case. There has been, though, in Germany, of course, the Illuminati that were created in Ingolstadt. And Ingolstadt was the headquarters of the Jesuits in Germany. It was Ignazio Loyola himself who had sent his first, I think, 14 disciples to Germany to counteract the Reformation and to work there for the establishment of one of the most important educational structures. And from that educational structure came out the father of Adam Weishaupt and Adam Weishaupt, who established the Jesuits, basing himself on every aspect of the Jesuits. I mean, he went through Ignazio Loyola's rules and regulations to then call himself a general, just like the general of the Jesuits. The Jesuits, you see, filled up what was missing in the church in 1540. What was missing was the Knights Templars. It was the Knights Templars that had created a big vacuum for the church.
So Ignatius and the Jesuits, are they descendants of the Knights Templar?
They wanted to become the heirs of the Knights Templar. For that reason, the devotion to the Holy Mary, which was also a devotion that the Knights Templars had. At the same time, though, they understood that the banking system that the Templars had created and brought out, it was like bringing a genie out of the bottle. They couldn't really get it back in, and they couldn't really make their mission banking. So their mission was instead education. And that was what they based their work on. Because once you educate people and you can then direct the narrative in the universities, then you can really rewrite history altogether.
Yes, which they do. Okay, rapid fire questions, because I want to respect your time. So, because I want you to come back.
Okay, that is in the back of the book, and is of course the
graphic. Explain why you added this communist symbol.
Because the red flag, you at the beginning of the show included a description of Pozzo's work, which is so important for the Jesuits in their mother church. Now, in their mother church, we see Jesus giving this red flag to Ignazio Loyola. And then we have also another aspect that you haven't pointed out, that there is an image there that is my graphic designer changed and placed the face of Karl Marx on next to Ignazio Loyola. There is another guy. So there is little things that have been. My graphic designer who works with me is an expert. He lives in the very religious region of Umbria. He comes from he's a expert of art from the university there and stuff. He's a guy who I've been who I know since 1989. So I know him forever. And he himself is an expert of symbolism. He had himself a background also with certain esoteric secret societies and so on. And for that reason, I collaborate with him for all my book covers. But we wanted to really represent in the cover of the book the essence of the Jesuits. And their essence is also at the base of communism, because that red flag is not simply an innocent red flag. It's also a red flag that manifests with the Reducciones, the Guarani Indians that get involved in this experiment, which is at the basis of communism. Then you have, if you go down in the cover of my book, down here, you have Lucifer. And then the eye of Lucifer is in the front cover also of the book, next to the symbol.
The front?
Here.
Okay.
Sorry? From the front, you have this eye behind, which is also the eye of in the back cover here of Lucy. So it's many references. You see, you have Lucifer down there.
Mm-hmm.
And Lucifer, though the eye, if you go and make that more larger and larger, you will find that it's the eye behind the eye that you have here. So it's little references that also, you know, when it comes out to the symbol of the Jesuits, these are all parts of the symbol. Even these three things are parts of the symbols of the Jesuits.
Amazing.
And this, which is then, of course, based on their long tradition of Mother Goddess reference that brings us all the way back to Ishtar. So the Jesuits are very much, let's not forget that Pope Francis himself was, for this reason, brought out of the Vatican. Now his residence, his burial place, is in a church that is outside the Vatican, the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore, Saint Mary Maggiore. And that church, like I explain in my book, has a long history with the Jesuits and with the Mother Goddess, because it used to be it was built on another temple of Cybele, which is, of course, the goddess of ancient Rome. So I hope that I gave you a full-on explanation here. And thank you so much for your questions. If you want to, you can have one last question.
Okay, thank you. There was one last question in the chat. So someone is asking, did you have any supernatural experiences in connection with secret societies?
Absolutely, yes. It's known in the Martinist order. They have a saying for that. It's in French, les choses. I had many experiences of the kind. I remember once I was in the hills near the castle of Saint Leo in North Italy, not far from Bologna, and during an initiation, we had like an explosion, like a fire, during the initiation when I was there. And it was actually an initiation in the Knights of Malta of the Orthodox tradition. Then I had also experiences, of course, during the magic of Abramelin the Mage, which I have talked about also in my book. So yes, definitely paranormal experiences, or even during the initiations that I myself, as a Grandmaster or as a Worshipper Master, gave to the initiates that when I was a Freemason. I remember that we had some paranormal activities, especially when we led these initiations in the middle of the night. Usually, you know, you tend to go home before midnight, even in the lodges. But we decided one night, I remember, to go all the way through to the morning. We had so many people, the candidates, and weird things happened because we were in a church. And we were actually close to the place where the Jesuits were founded. And I reawakened that order in the place in that castle where the Jesuits had actually been established with Ignazio Loyola. So many things happened, definitely.
Wow. And nothing now since you've come out?
Well, I tend not to gamble or play with the occult in any way. No, it's not something that it's something that we should avoid. And I will strictly suggest people not to play with this kind of forces.
Thank you for that. That's a good warning and admonition.
Yeah, absolutely. God bless you all.
Oh, God bless you.
For having me on, and we can continue this conversation maybe in the future.
Absolutely, would love that.
Oh, the best, definitely. God bless your ministries.
Oh yeah, let me show you. Louis, I'm sorry, I'm trying to do multiple things. Leo's contact information. This is his website.
Yes, leozagami.com. You can find all the links to my books there, my latest books, or you can find them, of course, on Amazon.
Yes, that's where I got mine. Okay, so for those of you who may have learned something that you've never heard before, if you were involved in Freemasons, the Illuminati, or if you were involved in anything that's related to the Jesuits, then God tells us, or Jesus says in John 4:23, but the hour cometh, and now is, When the true worshipers, let me bring myself back. There we go. When the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father seeketh such to worship him. So if you have realized that you have been involved in false teachings or outside of the Word of God, then consider where you are and prayerfully come out and renounce these things, because just as Leo said, you don't play with occult things. And so I encourage you to come out. If you have questions, please reach out to me, sgriffin.org. I'll be happy to pray with you, share information that I might have with you, or steer you in a direction of someone who has been where you are. So thank you for listening. Thank you for joining our broadcast. Thank you for the questions. They were fantastic. And we look forward to seeing you again. Until then, God bless you.
God bless.